You noticed it before you could explain it. Something shifted in the last few days, not externally but inside your perception. You woke up with a strange sense of anticipation, as if something important was approaching, yet there was nothing concrete to point to. No clear reason, just a quiet certainty that things were no longer exactly the same. And now you're here. This isn't random. When consciousness senses an upcoming change, it doesn't send notifications or explanations. It redirects attention. It nudges you toward information, moments, and encounters that prepare you before reality catches up. The question isn't why you clicked on this video. The real question is why your awareness arrived here at this exact point in time, just before something shifts. As we move into this exploration of the energetic field and its subtle cues, it's important to first grasp a concept often overlooked: the fact that your consciousness operates far beyond the boundaries of what we normally consider time. It functions not in a linear fashion, but in a way that allows it to be aware of changes before the rational mind can even process them. This is one of the key aspects of your consciousness that guides you in ways you might not even realize, until you start to pay attention. Imagine this for a moment. Before an earthquake strikes, animals like birds or dogs often sense the tremors long before humans do. This isn't a mystical trait. It's a natural instinct based on their heightened sensitivity to subtle shifts in their environment. Your consciousness operates in much the same way. It can detect subtle changes in the energetic field of your reality before your logical mind catches on to what's happening. This energetic sensitivity is how your body reacts to the presence of an invisible shift, long before it fully manifests in your external world. Over the last few days, you may have felt an underlying sense of something changing, even though you couldn't quite put your finger on what it was. You might have experienced moments of inexplicable fatigue, heightened intuition, or noticed that small things that never seemed significant before now seem strangely meaningful. These are all clues your energetic field is sending you. Your body is detecting these shifts long before you even consciously register them. That feeling of unease or perhaps even excitement is not just a random thought or emotional reaction, it's a response to the unseen changes already taking place. At this point you might be thinking, but how can this be? How can I sense something is changing before my mind can even grasp it? This is where the illusion of linear time comes into play. Your mind operates on a very linear scale, processing things from past to present to future. But your consciousness doesn't adhere to that same timeline. It has access to future patterns, glimpses into the way things will unfold. This is why sometimes you feel like you've known something before it happens, or why a thought or feeling seems oddly familiar, as if it's been planted there for a reason. 3 days before any major change happens, your body starts to show subtle signs, like the first whispers of a storm before the rain begins. These signs are often dismissed by most as meaningless or imagined, but for those who pay close attention, these signs are crucial. They're not random. They're the energetic codes that signal something is coming, and while most people ignore these signals, either dismissing them as just in their head or brushing them off as coincidence, the truth is that these are not random at all. They are the energetic vibrations of reality itself, signaling that a shift is imminent. Here's where the misunderstanding happens. Many people, trapped in the confines of their rational minds, dismiss the idea that there could be any significance to these experiences. They don't see the larger picture because their mind hasn't caught up to what their consciousness already knows. This is the mistake that so many make. They miss the opportunity to prepare, to align themselves with the energies that are already shifting around them. And when the shift finally happens, they're caught off guard, unable to make sense of what just occurred. What if, instead of ignoring these subtle signs, you chose to lean into them? What if you trusted that your consciousness is trying to guide you towards something important, even if you don't fully understand it yet? After all, your mind doesn't live in time the way you typically think. It is not bound by the rigid progression of seconds, minutes, and hours. It can access information from the future, pulling it into the present and offering you a window into what is to come. When you understand this, it shifts your entire perspective. You begin to see that your role in this reality is not passive. You are actively co-creating the reality you experience moment by moment. Each small choice, each shift in your awareness, contributes to the reality you will soon inhabit. This isn't about waiting for something to happen to you. It's about tuning into the energetic field and recognizing that you are part of the quantum dance of creation. Your choices, your actions, your alignment with the energy of the moment all play a role in shaping the reality that you will step into. But there's another layer to this. Many people around you might not understand what you're experiencing. They might think you're imagining things or that you're overthinking, and that's okay. You've felt this before, haven't you? That strange intuition, that nagging sense that you're onto something, even though others may not see it. This is how it feels to align with the unseen forces of the universe. Others might not understand it, but you will. Because deep down you've experienced these subtle shifts before, and you know that when you trust them, they often lead to something profound. So how do you prepare for this shift? The key is not in understanding every little detail about what's to come. Understanding will come in time, but right now the focus needs to be on alignment. You don't need to know all the answers. You don't need to see the full picture. But you do need to align with the energy that is calling you. And the fact that you are here, reading these words, is already an indication that the alignment has begun. As you move forward, it's important to remember that reality is not something that simply happens to you. It's something you shape through your awareness and your choices. Your consciousness is guiding you through a subtle yet powerful process of co-creation. The signs are already there, and as you begin to recognize them and trust them, you'll find yourself moving more fluidly through the shifts ahead. Now, as you start to connect the dots, you may realize that the transition has already begun. It's not something that will happen, but something that is happening right now. How you navigate this transition depends on how attuned you are to the subtle signs and energies at play. You are in the process of co-creating a new reality, one step at a time. And with each step, you become more attuned to the frequencies that are reshaping your world. 3 days before a deep change, the body almost always speaks first. Not in sentences, not in clear warnings, but in small disturbances that don't fit your usual pattern. It's rarely dramatic. It's subtle enough to be ignored, yet specific enough to feel unusual. A slight heaviness when you wake up. A restless night that had no obvious cause. A sense that your attention keeps drifting inward, as if something inside you is asking to be noticed. The body is not philosophical. It doesn't theorize about the future. It reacts. And when reality is about to reorganize itself around you, your nervous system often detects the shift before your thoughts can explain it. This isn't mystical language, it's practical observation. The body is designed to read patterns faster than conscious reasoning. It responds to changes in rhythm, coherence, and expectation long before the mind builds a story around them. You may notice your energy behaving differently. Tasks that normally feel easy suddenly feel heavier, not because something is wrong, but because your system is reallocating attention. When a transition approaches, the body often pulls energy away from outward performance and redirects it inward. This can feel like fatigue, but it's not exhaustion in the usual sense. It's more like a pause before movement, the way an animal becomes still before changing direction. Sleep can shift during this window. Some people wake up earlier than usual with a sense of alertness that doesn't come from anxiety. Others feel the opposite, deeper sleep, vivid dreams, or the sense that they've been working through something overnight. Dreams during these periods often feel unfinished or symbolic, rather than narrative, as if the mind is processing information that doesn't yet have a clear form. The important detail is not the content of the dream, but the change in texture. Something feels different. The body may also signal through repetition. You might catch yourself returning to the same thought, the same memory, or the same question without trying to, not obsessively but gently, as if something is being rehearsed. This isn't rumination, it's orientation. The system is calibrating itself, testing internal references before an external shift locks them into place. There are also physical sensations that don't rise to the level of pain, but still stand out. Pressure in the chest that isn't emotional distress, a subtle tightness in the throat without fear, a warmth in the hands or face that comes and goes. These sensations often appear briefly and disappear just as quickly, which is why they're easy to dismiss. But their timing matters. They arrive without a clear trigger and leave without resolution, like signals waiting for acknowledgement. What makes this 3-day window so significant is not the intensity of the signs, but their coherence. One sensation alone means nothing, but when several small changes appear together, especially if they're out of character for you, the pattern becomes meaningful. The body is excellent at pattern recognition. It doesn't announce conclusions, it offers clues. You may also notice your tolerance shifting. Sounds might feel louder, crowds more draining, conversations less interesting, or, in some cases, unusually precise. This isn't irritability, it's sensitivity. When a system anticipates change, it becomes less tolerant of noise and more responsive to signal. The body begins filtering more strictly, conserving resources for what matters next, even if you don't yet know what that is. One of the clearest indicators during this period is a quiet sense of expectancy without a specific object. Not excitement, not dread, but readiness. It's the feeling you get when you're early for something important, but don't yet see it approaching. The body is alert without being tense. This state often confuses the rational mind, which looks for reasons. When it can't find them, it labels the sensation as meaningless or imagined. This is where people usually disconnect from the process. The mind wants explanations before it allows attention. The body offers information without explanation. If the mind doesn't recognize the language, it assumes there's nothing being said. But the body doesn't need belief to function. It needs observation. It's also important to notice what isn't happening. Often 3 days before a deep change, old emotional reactions lose their charge. Things that once triggered you feel strangely neutral. This isn't numbness, it's release. The body is letting go of outdated responses to make space for something new. If you're not paying attention, you might mistake this for indifference or disengagement, when it's actually a sign of internal reorganization. At the same time, certain details may feel unusually sharp. A phrase someone says lingers longer than expected. A decision you've been postponing suddenly feels simpler, not because you've solved it, but because its relevance has changed. The body knows when a chapter is closing before the mind agrees to turn the page. None of these signs demand action. That's another reason they're overlooked. They don't push, they suggest. The body isn't asking you to do anything dramatic. It's asking you to notice, to slow down just enough to register that your internal state is no longer aligned with the same assumptions it was a few days ago. When these signals are ignored, nothing catastrophic happens. Life continues. But the opportunity to move with the change instead of being pulled by it quietly disappears. The body did its part. It delivered the message early, in a language older than thought. Whether that message is received depends entirely on whether the mind insists on certainty before allowing awareness. And this is where the next tension begins to form, because most people are trained to dismiss what they can't immediately explain, especially when it comes from within. The signs don't vanish because they were wrong. They fade because attention moved away. What follows is not confusion, but surprise. When the external shift finally becomes obvious and it feels like it came out of nowhere, even though the body had been signaling it all along. The mistake almost everyone makes is not that they fail to notice the signs. It's that they notice them and immediately explain them away. The sensation appears, the pattern repeats, the body signals a quiet disruption, and within seconds, the rational mind rushes in to neutralize it. I'm just tired. It's stress. I've been thinking too much lately. These explanations feel responsible, grounded, even intelligent, but they often function less as understanding and more as a reflex to restore familiarity. The mind is deeply invested in continuity. It prefers a predictable narrative, even an uncomfortable one, over uncertainty. When subtle signs appear before a deep change, They threaten that narrative. Not because they are dramatic, but because they don't fit. They arrive without a clear cause and point toward a future that hasn't taken shape yet. For the rational mind, this is intolerable, so it labels the signal as irrelevant and moves on. This is where the real mistake happens. By dismissing the signs, people don't stop the change. They simply remove themselves from participating in it consciously. The shift still occurs, but it feels abrupt, disorienting, or imposed from the outside. Later, they say things like, "I don't know how this happened so fast," or "Everything changed all at once." In reality, the change announced itself quietly. It just wasn't allowed into awareness. There's a cultural bias at work here, one that equates meaning with intensity. If something matters, we assume it should be loud, obvious, and emotionally charged. Subtlety is treated as weakness, but deep transitions rarely announce themselves with force. They begin as minor inconsistencies, small misalignments between how things have always been and how they now feel. Ignoring these inconsistencies doesn't preserve stability, it delays adaptation. Another layer of the mistake is mistaking explanation for resolution. When the mind finds a plausible reason for a sensation, it assumes the issue is settled, but explanation doesn't dissolve information. It only categorizes it. The body doesn't signal change because it wants a label. It signals change because something in the environment or in your internal trajectory has shifted. When that signal is explained away without being integrated, it remains unresolved beneath the surface. This is why people often experience a sense of being caught off guard by events that, in hindsight, feel strangely familiar. The familiarity isn't coincidence, it's recognition delayed. The body recognized the pattern early. The mind refused to engage until the pattern became undeniable. There's also a subtler form of dismissal that looks more respectful, but is just as distancing. It sounds like, "That's interesting, but I don't have time for this right now." This postponement feels reasonable. Life is busy. Responsibilities are real, but the body doesn't operate on schedules. When it offers a signal, it's responding to timing that isn't negotiable. Ignoring it doesn't make the signal wrong. It just means the system will find another way to deliver the message, often with more force. People often assume that paying attention to these signs means overreacting or dramatizing normal fluctuations. This fear keeps them in a false neutrality. They believe that the only alternatives are obsession or dismissal. But there is a third option: quiet acknowledgement. Not analysis, not action, just recognition. The mistake is thinking that if you notice something, you must immediately do something about it. So instead, people choose not to notice at all. Another reason these signs are ignored is social reinforcement. When you mention subtle pre-verbal experiences to others, they're often minimized or mocked, not out of malice but discomfort. Most people are not trained to listen to information that doesn't come with clear logic, so you learn, over time, to doubt your own perceptions. You internalize the idea that if something can't be explained easily, it shouldn't be trusted. This creates a split between internal data and external validation. Over time, this split weakens intuitive accuracy, not because intuition disappears, but because it's no longer consulted. The body keeps detecting changes, but the mind has learned to override the signal before it reaches conscious consideration. This is not ignorance, it's conditioning. The cost of this mistake isn't immediate chaos. It's gradual disorientation. You begin to feel slightly out of sync with your own life. Decisions feel reactive instead of responsive. Changes feel like interruptions rather than continuations. You adapt, but you're always a step behind. The irony is that people in this state often pride themselves on being rational and grounded, unaware that they're ignoring one of the most sophisticated pattern recognition systems they possess. What's rarely acknowledged is that ignoring these signs is also a way of avoiding responsibility. If the change arrives without warning, you can tell yourself there was nothing you could do. But if you admit that the signs were present, even faintly, then you must also admit that you had a role in how the transition unfolded. This is uncomfortable. It challenges the idea that life simply happens to you. So the mind protects itself. It chooses the comfort of surprise over the discipline of attention. It prefers to be shocked later than unsettled now. This preference feels harmless in the moment, but it shapes how reality is experienced over time. As this pattern repeats, something else begins to happen. The gap between internal signals and conscious awareness widens. Changes start to feel more extreme, not because they are, but because the early information was consistently ignored. The system learns that only intensity gets attention. Subtlety is no longer enough. And this is where the next realization starts to form, because once you see how often the mind dismisses what the body already knows, a deeper question emerges. What else has been filtered out? Not because it wasn't real, but because it arrived too quietly to compete with the demand for certainty. Linear time feels obvious because it's familiar. Seconds follow seconds. Days stack neatly into calendars. Causes come before effects. The mind relies on this structure to function. It needs order, sequence, prediction. But your consciousness has never been confined to this arrangement, even if you were taught to believe it was. What you're experiencing now is not the breaking of time itself, but the quiet realization that you were never fully inside it to begin with. Think about how memory actually works. You don't access the past as a fixed archive. You re-experience it in the present. A smell, a sound, a single phrase can pull an entire moment from years ago into your body as if it's happening now. Your heart rate changes, your posture shifts. The body responds as though time collapsed. If time were truly linear in consciousness, this wouldn't be possible. The past would stay where it belongs, but it doesn't. The same thing happens with the future, although it's less openly acknowledged. You've felt anticipation without a clear cause, a sense of familiarity towards something that hasn't happened yet, a certainty that a chapter is ending before any external proof appears. These experiences are often dismissed as imagination, but they follow the same mechanism as memory. Consciousness is sampling patterns, not timestamps. Linear time is a tool the mind uses to organize experience, not a law consciousness must obey. The mind moves step by step. Consciousness moves by resonance. It recognizes configurations, trajectories, probabilities. This is why your body can react to an upcoming change days before your thoughts catch up. It's not predicting the future in a dramatic sense. It's recognizing a pattern already in motion. You've likely noticed moments when decisions seem to arrive fully formed, not impulsive, not rushed, just suddenly clear. The reasoning came later, if at all. This is another crack in the illusion of linearity. The conclusion appeared before the process. The mind prefers to believe it worked through the steps invisibly, but often the steps weren't sequential, they were simultaneous. The idea that consciousness experiences time differently isn't mystical, it's observable. When you're deeply engaged in something meaningful, time compresses, hours disappear. When you're anxious or waiting, minutes stretch unbearably long. Clock time remains constant, but experienced time does not. This tells you something important. Time is not just an external measurement, it's an internal state. As your awareness becomes more sensitive, the mismatch between clock time and experienced time becomes harder to ignore. You begin to notice that certain moments feel dense, layered, as if multiple things are happening at once beneath the surface. Other moments feel empty, transitional, even if nothing externally marks them as such. Consciousness is already navigating these layers, even while the mind insists everything is happening one step at a time. This is why the signs before a major shift don't feel like warnings from the future. They feel like echoes. The body isn't looking ahead. It's responding to a field that's already changing. From the perspective of consciousness, the future isn't a distant point you eventually reach. It's a pattern that gradually becomes dominant. When that pattern grows strong enough, you feel it before you see it. The illusion of linear time is reinforced by language. We talk about before and after, then and now, as if experience were a straight line. But internally, you already know it isn't. You can be physically present in one place while emotionally anchored in another moment entirely. You can respond to a situation based not on what's happening, but on what you sense is coming. These aren't errors, they're features. Breaking free from linear time doesn't mean losing structure or becoming ungrounded. It means recognizing that sequence is only one way of understanding movement. Consciousness doesn't abandon time, it uses it selectively. It steps in and out, it samples ahead, revisits behind, and stabilizes where attention is needed most. This is also why sudden changes feel shocking only when awareness has been trained to stay locked in the present moment as defined by the clock. When you allow for the idea that consciousness has already been in contact with what's forming, the shock softens. Change feels less like interruption and more like arrival. You may start noticing that certain experiences feel late, as if they're catching up to something you already processed internally. Conversations, events, realizations arrive with a sense of confirmation rather than discovery. This doesn't mean you're detached from reality. It means your internal timing is no longer synchronized exclusively with external markers. As this becomes clearer, another shift quietly takes place. You begin to see that waiting for things to happen before adjusting your perception is optional. Consciousness doesn't wait, it orients. It prepares. It adjusts its internal posture long before circumstances demand it. And once you recognize that linear time is more of a convenient agreement than an absolute truth, a deeper implication starts to surface. If your consciousness isn't bound by strict sequence, then the changes you're sensing aren't approaching from ahead of you at all. They're already interacting with you, shaping your responses, influencing your choices, even as your mind continues to insist that nothing has happened yet. The transition didn't start when you became aware of it. It started when the conditions that support your current reality began to loosen. Awareness only arrives once the process is already underway. This is why the shift you're sensing doesn't feel like a sudden event waiting in the future, but like a quiet rearrangement already in progress, subtle yet irreversible. A new reality is never built in a single moment. It forms the way a landscape changes under the surface before a visible crack appears. Pressure redistributes. Old structures weaken. New pathways begin to carry energy. Long before anything obvious happens on the outside, your internal alignment starts responding to this reorganization. You feel it as restlessness or clarity or the sense that certain choices no longer fit the way they used to. What's important to understand is that nothing needs to happen for the transition to be real. The mind is trained to look for external markers, an announcement, a decision, an event that signals the beginning. But reality doesn't wait for permission. It evolves continuously. By the time a change becomes undeniable, it has already shaped the field you're moving through. This is why you may notice yourself behaving differently without intending to. Small preferences shift. Conversations that once held your attention feel flat. You're drawn toward different questions, different kinds of silence, different types of information. These aren't random tastes changing. They're signs that your internal compass is recalibrating to match a reality that's still forming, but already exerting influence. The transition is not something you step into later. You are already inside it. Every moment of hesitation, every pause where you feel unsure but strangely calm, is part of the shaping process. The future isn't waiting on the other side of a door. It's bleeding into the present through tiny adjustments in perception. You might notice that decisions now carry a different weight, not heavier but clearer. Some options feel closed without explanation. Others feel open even if you can't justify why. This isn't intuition giving commands, it's alignment narrowing possibilities. As a new reality takes shape, it doesn't invite every version of you to come along. It responds to the version that resonates with it. This can create a quiet discomfort, not fear, but dissonance. The old patterns haven't fully collapsed, but they no longer feel stable. You can still operate within them, but there's a sense of effort that wasn't there before. At the same time, the new patterns aren't fully available yet. They exist more as a pull than a place. This in-between state is often mistaken for confusion, when it's actually a sign of transition mid-formation. What's being shaped now isn't just external circumstances. It's your relationship to choice, attention, and meaning. The reality forming around you responds less to what you say you want, and more to what you consistently align with. This is why repeated small decisions matter more than dramatic intentions. The field you're entering is sensitive to coherence, not declarations. You may also notice that certain situations seem to resolve themselves without effort, while others stall no matter how much you push. This isn't luck or resistance, it's feedback. The emerging reality supports movements that match its direction and quietly drains energy from those that don't. When you stop fighting this feedback, the process becomes less exhausting. The idea that the transition has already begun can feel unsettling because it removes the illusion of control through timing. You can't prepare later for something that's already shaping you now, but it also removes unnecessary urgency. There's nothing you need to rush toward. The shaping is happening whether you strain or soften. Your role is not to force outcomes, but to notice where effort increases and where it dissolves. As this awareness deepens, you might sense that the future you're moving toward isn't completely unknown. It feels vague but familiar, like a place you've imagined without images. This familiarity doesn't come from certainty, it comes from resonance. Parts of you are already operating in that reality, adjusting habits, expectations, and thresholds quietly, without announcement. This is why trying to explain the transition too early often feels frustrating. Language lags behind alignment. The reality being shaped now is not fully representable in words yet. It's being built through lived adjustments, not concepts. When you attempt to define it too precisely, it slips away, not because it's unreal, but because it's still in motion. And as this shaping continues, another realization starts to press forward. If the transition is already underway, then your role is not to wait and see what happens, but to recognize how your attention, your small repeated choices, and your internal state are actively participating in the construction process, even when it feels like nothing has changed on the surface. Something subtle but decisive changes the moment you understand that you are not moving through reality as a passive observer, but as an active participant, shaping it in real time. Not in a grand, cinematic way, and not through constant intention setting or effort. The change happens much quieter than that. It happens in how you relate to what is already unfolding. When you stop seeing reality as something that happens to you, responsibility shifts. Not as blame and not as pressure, but as intimacy. You realize that your internal state is not a reaction to circumstances alone. It is one of the conditions those circumstances respond to. This doesn't mean you control outcomes. It means you influence probabilities through coherence. The quantum field, in practical terms, is not a mystical force waiting for commands. It is a responsive environment shaped by patterns of attention, expectation, and repeated choice. When you understand this, you stop asking why things are happening and start noticing how they are responding. This changes the quality of your awareness almost immediately. You begin to sense that moments are not neutral. Each situation carries a certain openness or resistance, depending on how you meet it. When you're misaligned, even simple actions feel heavy. When you're aligned, movement feels efficient, sometimes surprisingly so. This isn't motivation, it's resonance. The field doesn't reward effort, it responds to consistency. One of the first changes you may notice is a reduced need to force clarity. When you believe reality is external and fixed, you push for answers. You analyze. You try to resolve uncertainty as quickly as possible. But when you recognize co-creation, uncertainty becomes informative. You learn to stay with it a little longer, not because you enjoy ambiguity, but because you can feel when something is still forming. This patience isn't passive, it's attentive. You're still acting, still choosing, but you're doing so with an awareness that each small choice feeds back into the system. You begin to notice that repetition matters more than intensity. A single dramatic decision rarely reshapes a life. A series of small aligned decisions does. Your relationship with intention also changes. Instead of declaring what you want, you start noticing what you consistently move toward without force. The quantum field responds less to what you say you desire and more to where your attention naturally stabilizes. When attention, behavior, and expectation point in the same direction, reality reorganizes around that coherence. This is why co-creation doesn't feel like manifesting. It feels like collaboration. You're not imposing an outcome, you're adjusting your position within a dynamic system. When you shift internally, the feedback you receive shifts as well. Sometimes this feedback comes as opportunities, sometimes it comes as friction. Both are informative. Another change is how you interpret obstacles. When you see yourself as separate from reality, obstacles feel like opposition. Something is blocking you, something is wrong. But when you understand co-creation, obstacles become signals. They indicate misalignment, timing issues, or outdated strategies. You stop personalizing resistance and start reading it. This doesn't make life easier in a simplistic sense, but it makes it clearer. You waste less energy fighting what isn't responding. You redirect more quickly. You stop insisting on paths that no longer carry momentum. The field isn't punishing you, it's communicating. You may also notice that emotional reactions lose some of their grip, not because you suppress them, but because you see their role more clearly. Emotions become data instead of directives. They tell you something about alignment, coherence, or expectation, but they no longer automatically dictate your next move. This creates space between stimulus and response, and that space is where co-creation becomes tangible. Time perception shifts again here. When you're co-creating consciously, you're less fixated on outcomes and more engaged with process. You sense when something is ripening and when it's not. You stop rushing what hasn't stabilized yet. This doesn't slow progress, it prevents unnecessary detours. Another quiet change is how you relate to other people. You stop seeing them purely as causes of your emotional state and start seeing interactions as shared fields. Some connections amplify clarity, others drain it. This isn't judgment, it's observation. You become more selective, not out of avoidance, but out of respect for your own coherence. As this understanding deepens, control becomes less important than calibration. You adjust your internal posture, rather than trying to manipulate external conditions. You notice where your attention habitually goes, especially under stress, and how that attention shapes what comes next. You realize that even in moments where choice feels limited, orientation still matters. This is where the process becomes more precise. You begin to see that co-creation isn't about thinking positively or believing harder. It's about reducing internal contradiction. When your thoughts say one thing, your actions another, and your expectations something else entirely, the field responds with noise. When those elements align, the response becomes cleaner, and as this alignment sharpens, a new tension naturally emerges. If reality is responding to your internal state more than you realized, then the question is no longer whether change is possible, but how often your unconscious patterns have been shaping outcomes without your awareness. That realization doesn't close the process. It opens the next layer of attention, where the focus shifts from creating change to noticing what, quietly and consistently, has been creating you. When people close to you start saying you're imagining things, it usually isn't because what you're sensing is false. It's because what you're sensing doesn't fit inside the map they use to navigate reality. Most people don't relate to the world through subtle shifts, internal signals, or pattern recognition. They relate through visible evidence, shared agreement, and outcomes that can be named. When you begin responding to something that hasn't fully arrived yet, it creates discomfort for them. From their perspective, nothing has changed. The external markers are still in place. Your life looks mostly the same. So when you speak or behave as if something is already moving, it sounds speculative, premature, or imagined. They assume you're projecting meaning onto neutral experiences, because that's how they've been trained to interpret anything that can't be verified immediately. What they don't see is that you're not reacting to events, but to direction. You're responding to a shift in trajectory, not to a finished outcome. This difference is subtle but crucial. Most people only trust perception once reality has stabilized into a recognizable form. You're sensing it while it's still fluid. That puts you out of sync with shared timing, and shared timing is how social validation usually works. There's also a protective mechanism at play. When someone close to you hears you describe an internal knowing they don't have access to, it can trigger insecurity. Not consciously, but structurally. If your perception is accurate, it implies that reality can be sensed before it's explained. That challenges the belief that control comes from understanding everything first. Rather than question that belief, it's easier to question you. So they minimize. They say you're overthinking, they suggest stress, fatigue, imagination. These explanations feel caring on the surface, but they also restore equilibrium. If your experience is imaginary, then their way of perceiving the world remains intact. No adjustment required. Another reason this happens is that people close to you are accustomed to a consistent version of you. When your internal alignment shifts, even slightly, it disrupts expectations. You may pause longer before answering. You may disengage from conversations that once held your attention. You may hesitate where you used to rush. These changes are subtle, but they register. Without a clear explanation, others fill in the gap with assumptions. They're not responding to your words alone. They're responding to the change in your presence. And when presence changes without a visible cause, it creates uncertainty. Most people resolve that uncertainty by dismissing the source rather than exploring it. It's important to notice that their doubt doesn't come from careful evaluation. It comes from mismatch. They're comparing your inner data to an external reality that hasn't caught up yet. From that angle, your experience appears ungrounded. But that doesn't make it inaccurate. It makes it early. You've likely been here before. A moment when you felt strongly about a direction, a decision, or a truth that others didn't understand. At the time, it felt isolating. Later, when events unfolded, it made sense. This pattern repeats because the mechanism hasn't changed. You tend to register shifts at the level of coherence, not confirmation. Being told you're imagining things can create doubt, especially when it comes from people whose opinions matter to you. The temptation is to either over-explain or retreat entirely. Over-explaining drains clarity. Retreating creates disconnection. Neither is necessary. The more stable your internal alignment becomes, the less you need agreement to trust what you're sensing. There's a difference between imagination and perception. Imagination is driven by desire and narrative. It pushes toward outcomes. Perception listens, it adjusts. What you're experiencing doesn't feel like fantasy because it isn't energized by excitement or fear. It feels quiet, neutral, sometimes inconvenient. That's one of the strongest indicators that it's not imagined. Another detail worth noticing is timing. Imagined things usually demand immediate validation. They want to be acted on, shared, confirmed. Subtle perception doesn't rush. It waits. It allows reality to respond in its own sequence. If what you're sensing were purely imagined, it would likely collapse under inaction. Instead, it persists calmly, even when you ignore it. As you move through this phase, the gap between your internal experience and others' interpretations may widen briefly. That doesn't mean you're drifting away from reality. It means you're interacting with it at a different resolution. You're reading the undercurrent while others focus on the surface. This can feel lonely if you expect immediate understanding, but it's also a sign that something in you is recalibrating independently of social reinforcement. That independence isn't separation, it's differentiation. And as this differentiation settles, a new question naturally arises. If others can't see what you're sensing, not because it's unreal, but because it hasn't fully expressed itself yet, then the next step isn't to convince them. It's to understand how to remain aligned without needing validation, especially as the process moves closer to the point where perception turns into visible change. The moment you realize that understanding is not the requirement, something inside you relaxes. The constant effort to explain, categorize, and justify begins to loosen its grip. Alignment operates on a different axis than comprehension. Understanding belongs to the mind. Alignment belongs to the whole system. And deep change does not wait for the mind to catch up. Most people have been trained to believe that clarity comes first and action follows, that if you can explain what's happening, you're safe to move. But in transitions like the one you're in, this order reverses. The system aligns first, meaning comes later. When you try to force understanding too early, you create friction, not clarity. Alignment feels quieter than understanding. There's no dramatic insight attached to it. It doesn't arrive as a sentence or a conclusion. It shows up as a subtle easing when you move in one direction and a subtle resistance when you move in another. It's the difference between effort that drains you and effort that seems to recycle itself. When you're misaligned, the mind becomes louder. It asks more questions, it demands reassurance, it loops. This is often mistaken for curiosity or depth, but it's usually a signal that the system is trying to compensate for internal contradiction. When alignment is present, the mind doesn't disappear, but it softens. It stops pushing for premature answers. This is why trying to figure it all out often makes things worse. Understanding is linear. Alignment is relational. Understanding wants a complete map. Alignment only needs the next step to feel coherent. When you insist on seeing the entire path, you override the feedback that's already available to you. Alignment doesn't mean certainty. You can be aligned and still unsure. You can be aligned and still afraid. The difference is that your actions are no longer fighting your internal signals. You stop forcing yourself into explanations that don't fit just to feel in control. There's a common misunderstanding that alignment requires constant positivity or confidence. It doesn't. Alignment is not emotional, it's structural. It's the sense that your internal state, your attention, and your choices are no longer pulling in opposite directions. Even discomfort can be aligned if it's honest and clean. One of the clearest signs of alignment is simplicity, not in life circumstances, but in decision-making. Choices don't necessarily become easier, but they become clearer. You feel less compelled to justify them. You don't need as much external validation. You're less interested in convincing others because you're no longer trying to convince yourself. Understanding seeks closure. Alignment tolerates openness. This is why alignment often feels unsettling at first. It removes the false comfort of explanations that don't actually match your lived experience. It asks you to stay present with what's real rather than retreat into concepts. When you prioritize alignment over understanding, your relationship with timing changes. You stop rushing insights. You allow things to reveal themselves through interaction rather than analysis. You notice that clarity often arrives after movement, not before it. This is especially important during transitions. The reality forming around you is responsive to how you meet it, not to how well you can describe it. Alignment adjusts your posture within the field. Understanding tries to stand outside the field and observe it. One participates, the other delays. You may notice that when you stop demanding understanding, synchronicities increase, not because the universe is rewarding you, but because you're no longer filtering out information that doesn't fit a preconceived explanation. You're more receptive to feedback. You notice what works and what doesn't without turning it into a theory. Alignment also changes how you relate to mistakes. When understanding is the goal, mistakes feel like failures of intelligence. When alignment is the goal, mistakes are data. They don't threaten your identity. They refine your orientation. This shift requires trust, but not blind trust. It's trust built from observation. You notice that when you honor alignment, things tend to organize with less resistance. When you ignore it, friction accumulates. Over time, this pattern becomes difficult to deny. The most destabilizing part is realizing how often you've been waiting for permission from understanding. Waiting to feel ready, waiting to be sure, waiting to explain yourself clearly before allowing yourself to move. Alignment doesn't wait. It responds. And once you feel this difference in your body, not as an idea but as a lived contrast, something else becomes obvious. If alignment matters more than understanding, then the work ahead is not about collecting more information, but about staying coherent as the field continues to shift, especially when the external world begins to reflect what you've already been adjusting to internally. You didn't click on this video by accident. You were already moving toward it before you were aware of why. Something in you recognized the timing, the frequency, the moment. 3 days before a real shift, consciousness doesn't wait for evidence, it prepares. And now that preparation has crossed a line. The way you perceive reality from here on will not be the same, because you are no longer just reacting, you are participating. Nothing dramatic needs to happen for everything to change. The shift has already begun inside how you notice, choose, and align. From this point forward, reality won't feel like something pushing you, but something responding to you. If you stayed until the very end, write this exact sentence in the comments. I felt the shift before I understood it. This lets me know you were truly here until the last moment. And if this resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They continue this process at a deeper level. If you want more content like this, that's where the next step is already waiting.